There are two versions of you. One of them sits down to work, opens the laptop, and within 30 seconds is somewhere else entirely, refreshing a tab that was already refreshed, rearranging files that didn't need rearranging, suddenly remembering a message that has to be answered right now. The day passes. Small things get done. The one thing that mattered doesn't move an inch. The other version sits down, and something different happens. The noise in the head goes quiet. The task stops feeling like an obstacle and starts feeling like a rhythm. Time stops behaving normally. An hour disappears like it was 10 minutes. Nothing gets forced. It just moves. Most people spend their entire lives assuming the gap between these two versions is motivation. That there's a mood, a feeling, a spark that has to arrive before real work can happen. So they wait. They wait to feel ready, to feel inspired, to feel like today is the day the switch flips on its own. It won't. Not because you're broken, and not because you lack discipline. It won't flip on its own because it was never an emotional switch to begin with. I spent years operating exactly like this. I'd sit down to do something that mattered, feel a kind of low static resistance in my chest, and instead of naming it, I'd wait for it to pass. I told myself that once I had more energy, more clarity, more of whatever more meant that day, the resistance would disappear and the work would flow. It never did. Not once. Not because I didn't try hard enough. I tried very hard, for a long time, in exactly the wrong direction. I read the books. I tried the morning routines. I tracked my energy levels, my sleep, my caffeine intake, convinced that if I just optimized the inputs enough, the output would eventually follow. Some of it helped around the edges. None of it touched the actual problem, because the actual problem was never about energy, or sleep, or willpower reserves. It was about a single moment happening over and over, every single day, that I never once looked at directly. What changed wasn't willpower. It wasn't a better morning routine, or a better playlist, or a better desk setup, although I tried all of those too. What changed was a single realization about where the difference between those two states actually lives. It's not spread out across the whole task. It's compressed into the first few seconds of starting, and once you understand what happens in those seconds, you stop waiting for motivation entirely, because you realize it was never invited to the decision in the first place. If you're new to this channel, this is a place built around one idea. That real transformation doesn't come from hype, from speeches, or from convincing yourself you're a new person every Monday. It comes from quietly rebuilding the systems that run your mind, one piece at a time, without announcing it to anyone. If a stronger, quieter kind of discipline is something you're after, staying subscribed means you're here as this system gets built, video by video, instead of discovering it halfway through, missing the pieces that would have made the later ones make sense. A quick like on your way and helps this reach more people who are stuck in exactly the loop we're about to break down. It costs you nothing, and it's the reason channels like this keep getting to exist without needing to shout to be heard. Now let's go into the state most people live in without ever naming it correctly. Almost everyone alternates between these two states multiple times a day, often without noticing the switch happening at all. You might spend the morning stuck in avoidance on one task, then somehow lose yourself completely in a different one right after lunch, and never once ask why the exact same person, on the exact same day, behaved so differently in two situations that both, on paper, required roughly the same amount of effort. Most people chalk it up to mood, or energy, or how much coffee they've had. Almost none of them look at the actual structural difference between the two tasks, because nobody ever taught them that was the variable that mattered. Procrastination gets treated like a character flaw, like evidence that you're lazy, weak, undisciplined, some smaller version of the person you're supposed to be. That framing is not just unkind, it's inaccurate, and it's the exact reason most people never fix it. Procrastination isn't laziness. It's your mind actively avoiding something it has quietly classified as a threat, not a physical one, an emotional one. The task doesn't have to be dangerous in any real sense. It just has to be uncertain, undefined, or exposing in some way, and your mind will treat it the same way it would treat something genuinely risky. Think about what actually happens in the moment you sit down to do the hard thing. There's a task in front of you. Write the report, start the workout, have the conversation, build the thing you've been putting off for months. And in that instant, before a single productive thought forms, your mind runs a silent calculation. Is this safe? Is the outcome predictable? Do I know exactly what to do next? If the answer to any of those is no, discomfort shows up immediately, and your mind reaches for relief the same way it would reach for relief from any other kind of pain. The relief is right there, in your pocket, on your desk, in your inbox. A notification, a snack, a quick errand that suddenly feels urgent. None of these things are the real problem. They're just the nearest exit from an uncomfortable, undefined task. It helps to understand why ambiguity specifically produces this reaction, instead of just accepting it as a strange quirk of the mind. A mind that evolved to keep you alive is built to treat unresolved uncertainty as a potential threat, because for most of human history, uncertainty usually was one. Not knowing what's in the tall grass, not knowing whether a sound means danger. Hesitating in the face of the unknown kept people alive long enough to pass that same hesitation on. That same wiring is still running today, except now it fires in response to a blank document instead of a genuine physical threat. The document can't hurt you, but the part of your mind responsible for detecting danger doesn't know that distinction. It only knows that the outcome is undefined, and undefined has always meant proceed with caution at best and avoid entirely at worst. This is why procrastination never actually feels like rest, even though from the outside it looks like avoidance and inactivity. It feels like low-grade tension that follows you around all day, because some part of you knows the task hasn't disappeared. It's still there, waiting, getting slightly heavier with every hour you don't touch it. You check your phone, but the tension doesn't lift. You clean something that didn't need cleaning, but the tension doesn't lift. That's the tell. Real rest quiets the mind. Procrastination just redirects the noise somewhere else while the pressure keeps building underneath it. I want to be specific here, because vague descriptions of procrastination are part of why people can't solve it. It's not one thing. Sometimes it looks like opening 12 tabs that all feel like research for the task you're avoiding. Sometimes it looks like reorganizing your to-do list instead of doing anything on it. Sometimes it looks like telling yourself you'll start after one more small thing and watching that one more thing multiply for hours. In every version, the pattern is the same. The mind is avoiding the discomfort of an unclear first step by substituting a task that has a clear one. Reorganizing a list has an obvious first move. Writing the actual report often doesn't, not until you force it to. I remember one stretch, years ago, where I had a single project sitting on my desk for almost 3 weeks. Every morning, I told myself today was the day. Every evening, I'd look back and realize I'd answered emails, cleaned my inbox, watched something just for 10 minutes that turned into an hour, and never once opened the actual file. What's strange, looking back, is how busy those 3 weeks felt. I wasn't sitting around doing nothing. I was in constant motion, just motion aimed everywhere except the one place that mattered. That's the part nobody warns you about. Procrastination rarely looks like stillness. It looks like activity, just redirected activity, and that's exactly what makes it so easy to miss in yourself while it's happening. There's also a version of procrastination that's quieter and more dangerous than the obvious one, because it disguises itself as productivity. This is the person who spends 4 hours building the perfect system to track their goals, instead of working toward any of the goals themselves. Or the person who reads book after book about discipline, collects notes, highlights sentences, feels genuinely engaged the whole time, and never applies a single piece of it to the actual task sitting untouched in the corner of their life. Preparation feels like progress. It produces a sense of motion and even a small dose of pride. But if you strip away the appearance of it, it's the same avoidance mechanism as scrolling a phone, just wearing a more respectable outfit. This version is harder to catch precisely because it looks responsible from the outside and even feels virtuous from the inside. Nobody feels guilty after reading a book about discipline. Nobody feels guilty after building a beautifully color-coded planning system. The guilt only shows up later, quietly, when the actual task is still sitting exactly where it was, untouched, and the person realizes the last few hours produced the feeling of progress without any of the substance. If you want a simple way to test whether something is real progress or disguised avoidance, ask one question before you start it. Does this bring me closer to the finished task, or does it just feel related to it? Reading about writing is related to writing. It is not writing. Building a tracker for your workouts is related to training. It is not training. The test is uncomfortable because it's usually accurate, and accuracy is exactly what avoidance tries hardest to avoid. Now let's look at the other side of this. The state most people assume is the opposite of procrastination, but is actually running on the exact same machinery. Flow isn't the absence of difficulty. That's the first thing people get wrong about it. It's not some easy, breezy state where the work stops being hard. It's full immersion inside the difficulty, where the challenge and your ability to meet it are so closely matched that your mind stops narrating and starts executing. Self-doubt goes quiet, not because it was resolved, but because there's no attention left over to produce it. Time compresses. You look up and an hour has passed the way 10 minutes usually does. Researchers who've studied this state closely have found something that should completely change how you think about achieving it. Flow doesn't appear randomly, and it doesn't reward the emotionally ready. It shows up under specific, repeatable conditions. There has to be a clear target, not a vague ambition, but a defined objective you're moving toward in this exact moment. There has to be immediate feedback, some way of knowing in real time whether you're doing it right or drifting off course. And the challenge has to sit right at the edge of your current skill, enough to demand full attention, not so much that it tips into anxiety, not so little that it slides into boredom. Notice everything that's absent from that list. Motivation isn't a condition for flow. Mood isn't a condition for flow. Inspiration isn't a condition for flow. Flow is a structural event that happens when specific conditions are met, not an emotional reward that shows up when you've suffered enough or waited long enough. That single fact undoes almost everything people believe about how to get in the zone. You can see this same pattern across completely unrelated fields, which is part of why it's worth taking seriously instead of dismissing as a coincidence. A climber halfway up a difficult route isn't thinking about their mortgage or the argument they had that morning. There's a clear target 3 feet above them, instant feedback the moment their hand slips or holds, and a difficulty precisely matched to what they've trained for. A musician deep in an improvised solo isn't consciously deciding each note. There's a clear harmonic target, instant auditory feedback on whether it's working, and just enough unfamiliarity to demand full attention without triggering panic. Even something as ordinary as a good conversation can produce this same state. A clear thread to follow, instant feedback in the other person's reaction, and just enough uncertainty about what they'll say next to keep you fully present instead of half listening while planning your response. Different activities, completely different stakes, and the exact same underlying structure holding the state together. What this tells you is that flow was never reserved for elite athletes, artists, or people with unusually strong minds. It's not a personality trait some people have and others don't. It's closer to a mechanical outcome. Plug the right conditions into almost any task, and the state tends to show up on its own, regardless of who's doing the task. Which also means the reverse is true. Take any task, strip away the clear target, remove the immediate feedback, and mismatch the difficulty against the person's skill, and flow becomes almost impossible no matter how talented or motivated that person happens to be. This should be freeing in a way most self-improvement advice never manages to be. It means you were never competing against people with some innate advantage you don't have. The person who seems to effortlessly disappear into their work isn't wired differently at a fundamental level. They've just, whether consciously or by accident, arranged their tasks to contain a target, a feedback loop, and a difficulty that fits. You can arrange the exact same conditions around your own work starting today, and the state that's felt out of reach for years becomes available almost immediately. Not because you changed as a person, but because the structure around the task finally matches what the mind actually needs to enter it. Here's where almost everyone gets it backwards, and where I got it backwards for years. People treat procrastination like an enemy to be defeated through sheer discipline, and flow like a prize to be earned through inspiration. So they wait to feel disciplined enough to override the resistance, or inspired enough to slide into focus. And in that waiting, weeks turn into months, and months turn into the version of themselves they keep promising to become soon. I did exactly this. I told myself, more than once, that once I built enough willpower, the procrastination would simply stop showing up. It never did. Willpower isn't a reservoir you fill up over time and spin down like a battery. It's consumed almost instantly the moment you try to force yourself through a vague, undefined task using pure force. You can win that fight for a day, maybe two. You cannot win it as a permanent strategy because it was never designed to be won. This is also why so much of the advice built around discipline quietly fails people, even when it sounds true. Telling someone to simply be more disciplined is like telling someone standing in front of a locked door to simply want to walk through it more. The wanting was never the missing ingredient. What was missing was the key. And in this case, the key is structure around the entry point, not a stronger feeling on the other side of the door. People don't fail to build discipline because they're weak. They fail because they keep aiming discipline at the wrong target, spending it trying to push through ambiguity instead of using it, in a much smaller dose, to remove the ambiguity in the first place. This is worth sitting with, because it also explains why the same person can look extremely disciplined in one area of their life and completely stuck in another. It's never a global trait. Someone can train for a marathon with total consistency and still avoid a single difficult phone call for months. Not because their discipline evaporated between the two, but because one task had a training plan with a clear next session, and the other had nothing but a vague sense of dread and no defined first sentence. Discipline was never missing from that person. A structured entry point was. Let's put the two states side by side, because the comparison is where the real answer lives. Procrastination tends to happen under a specific set of conditions. The task in front of you is unclear, the definition of done is vague or missing entirely, and there's no immediate signal telling you whether the first move you're about to make is even the right one. Flow tends to happen under the opposite conditions. The task is specific, the very next action is obvious without requiring a decision, and you get some kind of instant feedback that keeps you locked onto the path. Same brain, same person, on the same day, sometimes within the same hour. Completely different setup around the task itself. Take two people with the exact same goal. Both want to write a book. One of them sits down, opens a blank document titled Book, and stares at it, unsure whether to start with the plot, the characters, or an outline, and closes the laptop 20 minutes later having written nothing. The other sits down with a single, specific target. Finish this one scene, where this one character says this one line that's already decided in advance, and get instant feedback the moment it reads wrong out loud. Both people want the same outcome. Only one of them built a front door into the task. The other left it as a solid wall with book written on it, and then quietly concluded the wall meant they weren't a real writer, when the actual problem had nothing to do with their identity and everything to do with the missing door. This is the part that changes everything, and it's worth sitting with for a second instead of rushing past it. The difference between procrastination and flow was almost never about who you were that day. It wasn't about your discipline, your mood, your energy levels, or how together you felt when you woke up. It was about whether the task in front of you was structured to be entered or accidentally structured to be avoided. Think about the last time you procrastinated on something and then, almost by accident, ended up in flow on a completely different task the same day. That's not a contradiction. It's proof of the whole argument. Your discipline didn't change between the two tasks. Your energy didn't reset. What changed was the structure sitting in front of you. One task had a vague entry point and no clear signal of progress. The other, even if it was objectively harder, had a clear next move and some way of knowing you were on track. The version of you that procrastinated in the morning and flowed in the afternoon was the same person, running the same system, responding correctly to two very different setups. This is worth repeating because it contradicts almost everything most people believe about themselves after a bad week of procrastination. They don't conclude that task had a structural problem. They conclude something is wrong with me. And that conclusion is not only wrong, it's the exact thing that makes the next task even harder to approach, because now there's a layer of self-doubt sitting on top of the original ambiguity. Removing that false conclusion is, on its own, worth almost as much as the practical fix, because it stops the spiral before it compounds into something bigger than the original task ever was. Before we get to exactly how to use that, I want to pause here for a second, because if any part of what I just described sounds familiar, it's worth acting on now rather than filing it away as interesting and moving on, which is usually where good information goes to die. What I described, the tension that never quite resolves, the mind reaching for smaller tasks to avoid a bigger one, the sense of being busy without actually moving forward, that pattern doesn't fix itself with more information. It fixes itself with a small, consistent practice that retrains how your mind responds the moment resistance shows up, before it has a chance to spiral into hours of avoidance. That's the entire premise behind the K.M.A method. 5 minutes a day, built specifically around training your mind to recognize that early moment of resistance and move through it deliberately, instead of defaulting into whatever feels safest in the moment. It's not another productivity system stacked with rules you'll abandon in a week. It's 5 minutes, done consistently, aimed directly at the exact mechanism we've been talking about. I've used it during periods where procrastination was winning almost every single day. Long stretches where I knew exactly what I needed to do and still couldn't get myself to start. The shift wasn't dramatic or instant. Nothing about it felt like a breakthrough moment. It was quiet, and it compounded, the same way most real change does. A week in, starting felt slightly less heavy. A month in, the gap between deciding to do something and actually doing it had shrunk enough that I noticed it without looking for it. That's usually how you know something is actually working. Instead of just feeling good in the moment, it shows up in the small, boring details of an ordinary Tuesday, not in some dramatic before and after. If you want to see exactly how it works, point your camera at the QR code on screen right now, or check the link sitting in the description. Take 30 seconds to look at it. The rest of what we're covering here will make even more sense once you understand the mechanism behind it. So let's get back into it. Now that we've laid both states side by side, let's go one level deeper into the actual comparison, because this is where most explanations of flow and procrastination stop, and where the real answer is still hiding. It's tempting to conclude that the fix is simply make tasks clearer. That's true, but it's incomplete, because it doesn't explain why the same task can feel impossible to start on one day and effortless to start on another, even when nothing about the task itself has changed. The missing piece is the entry point, the specific first physical or mental action that has to happen before momentum takes over. Most tasks fail not because they're difficult overall, but because their entry point is vague. Write the report has no obvious first move. Is the first move outlining, researching, opening the document? Each of those feels like a decision, and every decision your mind has to make before starting is another opportunity for it to choose avoidance instead. Flow states almost always begin with an entry point that required no decision at all. The runner doesn't decide whether to run. They've already put the shoes on, and the shoes on their feet make the next move obvious. The rider who enters flow easily usually isn't deciding what to write in that first moment. They're continuing a sentence that was left unfinished on purpose the day before, so there's no blank page staring back, only a continuation. Procrastination thrives in decision points. Flow thrives in continuations and obvious next moves. This is also why willpower fails as a long-term strategy, and why relying on it keeps people stuck in the exact same loop for years. Willpower is what you use when you're standing at a decision point, trying to force yourself through it by sheer force. It works sometimes, expensively, for a short window, but it doesn't remove the decision point. It just fights through it one time, and tomorrow, the same vague task with the same undefined first move will be sitting there again, requiring the same expensive fight. People who consistently get into flow aren't spending more willpower than everyone else. They're spending almost none because they've engineered away the decision point entirely. So here's the actual verdict. The thing this entire comparison has been building toward. The task itself is rarely the real obstacle. The entry point is. Most people fail before they've even begun, not because the work is too hard, but because they tried to start something that had no clear, decision-free first move. And a mind facing an unclear first move defaults to avoidance almost every single time, not out of weakness, but because that's what minds are built to do with ambiguity. The people who consistently and repeatedly enter flow aren't more disciplined than everyone else, and they're not luckier with their mood on a given day. They've simply learned, sometimes without even realizing it, to design the first 60 seconds of any task so specifically that avoidance has nowhere left to hide. This reframes almost every failed attempt at change you've ever had. That gym membership that went and used wasn't a failure of commitment. It was a task with no clear entry point, sitting behind a decision every single morning about when, how, and whether today was the day. That business idea that never left a notes app wasn't a failure of ambition. It was an enormous, undefined outcome with no obvious first move, competing every day against smaller tasks that did have one. None of this means the goals were wrong or that you didn't want them badly enough. It means the entry point was missing, and a missing entry point will beat a strong intention every single time, because intention operates on feeling, and feeling was never a reliable variable to begin with. It's worth sitting with how much weight this lifts off things you've probably been carrying as personal failures for years. Every unfinished project, every abandoned routine, every "I'll start Monday" that quietly became a pattern. None of it required a different, stronger version of you to fix it. It required a different relationship with the first 60 seconds of the task, which is a completely learnable skill, not a fixed trait you either have or don't. Now let's talk about exactly how you use this, because understanding it without applying it changes nothing. Before you start anything that matters, stop asking yourself the question most people default to, which is some version of "what do I need to do?" That question is too broad, and broad questions are exactly what triggers the avoidance response we talked about earlier. Replace it with a much smaller, much sharper question. What is the smallest, most specific action I can take in the next 2 minutes? Not, write the report, open the document, and write one sentence, even a bad one. Not, work out, put your shoes on, and walk to the door. Not, have the difficult conversation, send the message that says you'd like to talk today. The action has to be small enough that your mind can't find a reasonable argument against it, and specific enough that there's no ambiguity left for avoidance to hide inside. This works because it removes the decision point instead of trying to power through it. You're not asking yourself to feel motivated, ready, or in the right headspace. You're asking yourself to do one small, obvious thing that requires no internal debate. And here's the part that surprised me the first time I actually paid attention to it. Once you're moving, even on that tiny first action, the state usually shifts on its own, without you doing anything else to force it. You don't fight your way into flow through discipline. You design your way into it through structure, and the discipline you thought you were missing was never really the missing piece at all. Apply this everywhere the pattern shows up. If a piece of work has been sitting untouched for days, don't ask what the whole project requires. Ask what the next 2-minute action is, and do only that. If you've been avoiding a conversation, don't rehearse the entire speech in your head. Just write the first line you'd actually say and send it. If you've been circling a decision for weeks, don't try to solve the whole decision today. Write down the smallest piece of information you'd need to move one step closer to it, and go get that one piece. Every one of these examples follows the same underlying rule. Shrink the entry point until there's no room left for avoidance. There's a version of this that works especially well for anything creative or open-ended, where the lack of a clear finish line makes procrastination especially strong. Instead of trying to finish, define the smallest visible unit of progress you could produce in the next 10 minutes, and treat that as the entire task. A single paragraph, a single rough sketch, a single working version of one small piece, not the whole thing. This does two things at once. It removes the intimidating scale of the full task, and it gives you the kind of immediate feedback we talked about earlier as one of the actual conditions for flow. You finish the small unit, you can see it's done, and that tiny signal is often enough to pull you into the next one without any additional push. This same principle applies almost identically across the areas of life where people get stuck the most. In relationships, the hard conversation you've been avoiding for weeks doesn't need to be planned in full. It needs one specific opening line, decided in advance, that you're allowed to say without knowing exactly where the rest of the conversation goes. In health, the workout you keep skipping doesn't need a perfect plan for the next 12 weeks. It needs shoes on your feet and a walk to wherever the workout happens. The plan can be figured out once you're already moving. In finances, the budget you've been avoiding doesn't need a complete system built in one sitting. It needs one specific account opened, or one specific number written down, today. In learning a new skill, the course you bought and never opened doesn't need a full study plan mapped out in advance. It needs the first video opened and the first 5 minutes watched, nothing more decided ahead of time than that. In every domain, the mistake is the same. Treating the entire outcome as the entry point, instead of isolating the one small, specific, decision-free action that actually gets you moving. It also helps to notice what happens in your body in the moment right before you'd normally avoid something. There's usually a small, physical signal, a tightening somewhere, a slight urge to check your phone, a sentence in your head that sounds like, "I'll do this in a minute." That signal is the actual decision point we've been talking about the entire time. Once you can recognize it in the moment it happens, rather than an hour later when you're already 3 tasks deep into avoidance, you can respond to it directly with the 2-minute action instead of the automatic escape. This is, essentially, exactly what a structured daily practice trains. Not willpower in the abstract, but the specific skill of catching that signal early and redirecting it, 5 minutes at a time, until it becomes closer to automatic than effortful. The first few times you try this, it will feel unnatural, almost too small to matter. That's expected, and it's not a sign it isn't working. Your mind has spent years, maybe decades, associating the approach of a hard task with the relief of avoidance, and that association doesn't dissolve after doing the opposite once or twice. It weakens gradually, the same way any well-worn habit does, through repetition rather than intensity. The goal on any single day was never to feel completely different. It was to interrupt the pattern one more time than the day before, and let that accumulate quietly over weeks until the interruption stops requiring conscious effort at all. A few things worth being careful of as you start using this. Don't turn this into an excuse to plan forever instead of starting. There's a version of this advice that quietly becomes its own form of procrastination, spending 20 minutes designing the perfect, tiny first step instead of just taking an imperfect one. The goal isn't precision. It's speed toward motion. If you're spending more time defining the entry point than it would take to just do it, you've missed the point entirely. Pick something small, imperfect, and specific and move. Don't expect this to remove difficulty from the work. That's not what it does, and expecting it to is its own kind of setup for disappointment. Flow doesn't mean the task becomes easy. It means the difficulty stops registering as a threat and starts registering as a rhythm you're inside of, rather than a wall you're standing outside of. The report is still hard to write well. The workout still burns. The conversation still requires courage. What changes is where the resistance shows up. Not throughout the entire task anymore, just at the very beginning, in that first 60 seconds, and it's far easier to push through 60 seconds of resistance than an entire day of it. And don't assume one good day proves the system or one bad day disproves it. This isn't about achieving a permanent state where procrastination never shows up again. It shows back up. The difference is what you do the moment it does. Whether you go looking for the smallest possible entry point immediately, or whether you let the vague, undefined version of the task sit there for another few hours while you wait for a feeling that was never coming. There's one more trap worth naming, because it catches people who've already understood everything up to this point. Once someone learns that small, specific entry points work, they sometimes start using that same logic to avoid the moments that genuinely require sustained effort, telling themselves they'll just do 2 minutes of something and using that as permission to stop the second the 2 minutes are up every single day on a task that actually needed more than that to move forward. The 2-minute entry point is a tool for starting, not a ceiling for how far you're allowed to go once you're already moving. Most of the time, once you're in motion, momentum carries you well past the original 2 minutes without any extra effort. If it doesn't, that's fine too, but don't quietly turn a starting technique into a new, more sophisticated way of doing less than the task actually requires. Be careful too about comparing your entry points to someone else's. What counts as a small, specific first step is completely relative to the person and the task. Someone who's written for years might outline the next chapter as a perfectly reasonable entry point, while for someone starting out, that same instruction is still too broad and will trigger the exact avoidance we've spent this video dismantling. There's no universal size for a first step. The only real test is whether it requires a decision or not. If you're still debating what exactly to do the moment you sit down, the step wasn't small enough yet, no matter how small it looked on paper. Shrink it again, as many times as it takes, until the only thing left standing between you and starting is the act of starting itself. If there's one thing I wish someone had told me clearly, years before I figured it out on my own through a lot of wasted time, it's this: you were never missing motivation. You were never missing discipline in the way you assumed you were. You were missing a system that didn't require either one to function. A way of shrinking the entry point until the decision that used to trip you up simply wasn't there to make anymore. That exact idea is what the K.M.A method was built around from the ground up. 5 minutes a day, structured specifically to train your mind to recognize resistance the second it shows up and move through it with a small, deliberate action, instead of defaulting to whatever feels safest in that moment. There's a reason it's built around 5 minutes instead of an hour-long routine most people abandon within a week, because the entry point, not the total time invested, is what actually determines whether someone follows through long enough to see change. Think about it this way. Almost every system that's ever failed you probably asked for too much on day one. An hour of meditation, a complete overhaul of your schedule, a routine so demanding that missing it once felt like failing entirely, which made missing it twice feel inevitable. 5 minutes doesn't ask you to reorganize your life around it. It asks for less resistance than checking your phone, which means the entry point problem we've spent this entire video on doesn't even apply to starting it. That's not an accident. It's the same principle we've been discussing this whole time, just applied to the practice itself instead of to a report or a workout. If you've made it this far into this video, this is exactly the kind of system you've been circling without a name for it. Point your camera at the QR code on screen, or find the link in the description below, and take a real look at it today, not once you feel ready. Now, before you go, I want you to actually do something with this, not just carry it around as an interesting idea for a few days and let it fade the way most things do. Pick one task you've been avoiding, something specific, something that's been sitting there quietly getting heavier. Not the whole task, just the first 60 seconds of it. Define that first 60 seconds so precisely that there's no ambiguity left inside it, nothing left for your mind to hide behind. And do it today, not tomorrow, not once you feel ready, not once the mood shows up. Today, in the next hour, before this feeling fades the way it usually does. Tell me in the comments exactly what that task is and exactly what the first 60 seconds of it looks like for you. Be specific, not start my business. What's the actual 2-minute action? Not get healthy. What's the actual first movement? I want to see the real, small, specific things people have been avoiding, because naming them out loud is often the first entry point in itself. If this changed how you see the difference between those two versions of yourself, the one who avoids and the one who disappears into the work, subscribe and share this with someone who's been stuck in the same loop, waiting for a feeling that was never going to arrive on its own. There's a full system being built here, one quiet piece at a time, for people who'd rather change in silence than talk about changing. Most people will watch this, feel something click, and go back to their day exactly as before, because understanding a pattern and interrupting it are two entirely different actions, and only one of them requires you to actually do something in the next few minutes. Don't be the version of yourself that nods along and changes nothing. Close this video, and before you open anything else, do the smallest possible version of the one thing you've been avoiding. Not because you feel ready, because you finally understand that feeling ready was never going to be the thing that started it. Keep building. Quietly, if you have to. Just keep building.